Okay, so let's go ahead and look through a quick review of Chapter 6 in your NASM. So we're looking at, this is our final exam review for PFT 101. This is PowerPoint 5 if you're following along with your big list. So first thing we want to kind of go over again is reminding you everybody what subjective versus objective information is, right? Subjective information is any information that cannot be measured. These are things like lifestyle, occupation, medications, injuries, personal history, likes, dislikes, things like that. So the two primary ones that you're going to look at are going to be your PAR-Q, that's your Physical Activity Readiness Questionnaire. These are questions directed towards like cardiorespiratory dysfunction. So if your client answers yes to any of those, you're going to want to make sure that they have written permission from their doctor before they begin exercise. And that's just the best thing you can do to keep yourself and the client safe. Then we also have your general and medical history questionnaire, which is just basic information about your client's like background, right? So it's like, what is your occupation? What are your hobbies? Like, what do you like? What do you dislike? What medications are you on? You know, are you on something like a beta blocker, which could lower your heart rate and lower your blood pressure, you know? So we want to gather that information because it's very useful, very helpful information that helps us in regards to our program design. Like if your client says that they hate running, when you're doing your warm-ups and stuff, you're probably not going to focus on like putting them on a treadmill to go for like a light jog. Instead, you know, if they say that they really like going on like bike rides, you can warm them up by putting them on a spin bike or something like that. So that's your subjective information. It's the stuff you cannot measure. And then we have our objective information, which is really where the rest of our assessments take place. And this is all the stuff that you can measure, right? So this is information that's typically number-based, although not necessarily always. You know, like if we're looking at someone's knees caving in, like that is objective information. Even though we don't slap a number on it, because you could slap a number on it if you were to use like a goniometer to mark how many degrees their knees cave in. So first category we're going to look at in terms of objective information is going to be our physiologic assessments. These are going to be things like your heart rate, right, which is the number of times your heart beats in a certain in 60 seconds. Then we also have our target heart rate, which is like, you know, your goal of how many times you want the heart to beat in 60 seconds. So if I, you know, wanted somebody to, you know, be between 130 and 140, right, that's a very specific target heart rate. We also have blood pressure, which is a physiologic assessment. That determines like how much pressure is in your actual blood vessels. Normal range is about 120/80, although, you know, if it falls outside of those normal ranges, you know, if it's 140/90 all the time, that's what we consider hypertension, and that puts our client at risk. So it's something to be aware of when you're designing your programs, because if your client does have hypertension, you don't want to do a lot of exercises that involve like a lot of head movement, because that could cause them to get lightheaded and pass out. We also have our body composition assessments, which are also objective. These are things that are related to, you know, body fat percentage or weight or circumference measurements, right? So the first one we're looking at is percent body fat. We got a couple different ways that we can gather percentage of body fat. You know, we have skin fold measurements, which is estimating your body fat percentage by basically measuring the amount of subcutaneous or below the skin fat. We are going to use what is called the Dernan-Wamersley formula, which is a 4-site method. Biceps, triceps, subscapular, and iliac crest. So basically just like between your belly button and iliac spine. So we're going to use those 4 sites to basically gather the thickness of those skin folds, add them all up, and that's going to estimate our body fat percentage. We also have bioelectric impedance. This is probably what you might be familiar with if you've ever gone and had your body fat tested. This is sort of one of the most convenient, quick methods. But basically, you hold on to a bioelectric impedance tester, and what it does is it runs an electric current from point A to point B. So, you know, it'll have 2 points of contact, and it knows how fast that electric current should travel through things like water. And we know that muscle has more water in it. So if you tell somebody, if you tell the machine that you weigh 170 pounds and then you hold on to it and it moves through very quickly, that means that that 170 pounds is mostly water, and therefore that person has a lower body fat percentage. If that electric signal travels very slowly, then we know that that 170 pounds is made up of more fat tissue, and therefore like they're going to have a higher body fat percentage. So that's bioelectric impedance. We also have hydrostatic weighing. We know how much fat weighs under when it's underwater because fat actually is hydrophobic, so it will actually lift out of water. It's more buoyant than water is. So if you weigh 200 pounds and you submerge yourself in water, we know how much 200 pounds would weigh depending on how much like body fat there is. So that's actually going to be our most accurate method, is hydrostatic weighing. Other body composition assessments that we have are going to be circumference measurements. This is going to measure your body girth, right? The ones we're going to look at are going to be the neck, chest, waist, biceps, thigh, hips first, then thigh, and calf. Those are sort of the most common. Generally, the two most important, though, are going to be the waist and the hip ratio, because that actually can tell you the waist to hip ratio between the two, right? So if I measure like my waist at the narrowest part of my waist, and I measure my hips at the widest part of my hips, and I put those over each other, that's going to give me the ratio. So we know that body waist to hip ratios that fall outside of normal ranges will result in, or typically result in more like hypertension, greater risk for diabetes, heart disease, things like that. So that's one of the reasons we look at this. It's almost a way of saying like a high body fat percentage actually can be okay as long as that body fat is sort of evenly distributed. Then we have body mass index, right? Body mass index is going to be a calculation of your height versus your weight. Our normal formula for this is going to be your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So that's the formula they're going to want you to know. It's not necessarily the greatest indicator of health in the world, but if you fall outside of those normal ranges, you are putting yourself at increased risk for certain types of diseases. Then we also have our cardiorespiratory assessments. So cardiorespiratory assessments, primarily we're going to talk about two in your regular textbook, but they give us information about cardiorespiratory efficiency. So you're going to have your YMCA 3-minute step test, which is determined, helps you determine your training zones based on sub-maximal stair climbing at a very set pace. So you have the same height, you're going to go at the same rate every single time. So therefore, it put the exact same amount of stress on your heart every single time. And then what you do is you measure your client's recovery pulse. If their pulse recovers really quickly, we can be a little more advanced about our cardio testing. Our cardio workouts. And if they recover very slowly, we want to be a little more gentle about how we do cardio, give our client more extended rest periods. We also have the Rockport walk test, which is actually going to be used to estimate your client's VO2 max. So that's the maximum amount of oxygen they can consume. And that's basically a 1 mile bout of sub-maximal walking. So you are going to like walk as fast as you can. And we're going to get what your heart rate is at the end there. But you shouldn't be breaking into a jog. And that can be used to estimate VO2. The more oxygen you can consume, the better cardiovascular shape you are in. So that's what we're looking for there. Then we also have our dynamic posture assessments. These are arguably one of the most important types of assessments that we are going to do. Our four main ones that we're going to look at are the overhead squat assessment, the single leg squat assessment, pushing assessment, and pulling assessment. So your overhead squat is a posture assessment that assesses dynamic flexibility and integrated total body strength. So what we are looking for there, we are observing from two primary angles in your regular textbook, then we introduce a third in your corrective exercise textbook, but you're going to observe your client with toes pointing forward, arms overhead bisecting the ears, and they are going to squat down to a comfortable height. If you notice things like their feet turning out or knees caving in, their low back arching, they have an excessive forward lean, or their arms falling forward, any of those things mean that we have overactive and underactive muscles. And we'll go ahead and look at that list here in just a minute. Then we've also got our single leg squat assessment, which is going to assess your ankle proprioception, core strength, and hip stability. So this is just like your overhead squat, except you're looking for one thing: does that knee cave in? So as they are single leg squatting, if their knee caves in, it's going to mean the exact same thing as their knees caving in during the overhead squat. We're also going to look at pushing and pulling assessments, which are essentially the same assessment because they are the same joint action, but they're performed from different directions there. So Your pushing assessment is an upper body assessment that assesses dynamic flexibility, core strength, and upper body control. And then the same thing is true for your pulling assessment. This one you are only going to observe from a lateral view, and you are going to look to see if they have a low back arching. So as their core is supposed to stabilize while they're doing a pushing or pulling motion. If it doesn't, that results in an arching motion. Or you're going to look to see if they have elevating shoulders or a forward head posture. And again, we'll look at those in just a minute. Then finally, our last category of assessments that we've got are going to be our performance assessments. These are used to improve and track your athletic performance, whether they're agility-based or strength-based. So we've got our Davies test, which is a performance assessment that assesses your upper extremity agility. That's with your two hands 36 inches apart. You're going to reach across and touch hand to hand there. Then you got the Shark's skill test, which is where you stand with your hands on your hips in a grid, in a box that is 9 12-inch squares, and you're going to jump from box to box to box as fast as you can. That's a lower extremity agility assessment. Then we've got strength assessments, which are going to be used to help us determine, what weight to give our client while they are actually exercising. So we can use this to determine their percentage of 1 rep max. So you've got your bench press assessment, which is an upper extremity strength assessment, and your squat assessment, which is a lower extremity strength assessment. And both those are going to be used to help us determine your client's weight to do during the workout. If you're trying to lift at 80% of their 1 rep max and their 1 rep max is 100 pounds, you're going to have them lift 80 pounds, right? And you don't just have to do the bench or the squat. You can do deadlifts or military presses. You can do any exercise you want for a 1 rep max assessment. It doesn't need to be performed for every exercise you're going to choose. I mean, that's going a little overboard. Typically, you're going to want to do this on the big 5 compound lifts, like bench press, barbell squat, deadlift, military press, and a bent over row. Those are sort of the ones that are most applicable. Then obviously you've got things like pull-up assessments and push-up assessments that you can do as well. But generally these are the 2 primary ones for the upper extremity and for the lower extremity. So those are all of our assessments in a nutshell. The one other thing I wanted to go over was looking at our postural distortions in a master list. So I'm not going to re-go through every single one of these muscles. I know that we've already done that in class, and that could make this a little dry and boring. But if we do look at our basic movement compensations here, the most common ones that you're going to see if you are looking from the anterior view of the overhead squat are going to be feet turning out, which is basically overactive calf muscles and internal rotators of the hip. And then you're going to look at your underactive muscles, which are exactly the opposite, right? Those are going to be hip external rotators and tibial or calf muscles in the medial side. So we're seeing a little bit of altered reciprocal inhibition and a little bit of synergistic dominance. With your knees caving in, you're going to look a lot at the muscles that are overactive. The muscles that need to be stretched are your adductor muscles and internal hip rotators. What we want to strengthen are your external hip rotators and abductors, right? So that's going to pull those knees out. So we strengthen the underactive stuff and stretch the overactive stuff. Now, in the corrective exercise class, you won't see questions related to this in your final, but if we look at knees caving out, this is a CES concept. Your probable overactive muscles are exactly the opposite of knees caving in. So these are your overactive external rotators and overactive abductors, whereas you have underactive adductors, right? Then we see excessive forward lean. This is another one of our common ones. Those overactive muscles are going to be in 2 different places. So it's either going to be your calves because you have limited dorsiflexion. So then you kick your butt out in order to counterbalance your weight. So that's overactive calves and underactive tibialis muscles. So underactive dorsiflexors. Or it's going to be your hip flexors and abs are actually pulling you downward to stabilize your core, rather than your core and low back actually being strong enough to stabilize on their own. So then you end up getting pulled down. So how do you determine whether or not it's an excessive forward lean from the calves or if it's from the hips? Well, you elevate the heels, and when you put your client into elevation, they're already in plantar flexion, so now the soleus and gastrocnemius don't have to stretch anymore. So if you take the stretch away and all of a sudden their squat is perfect, you know that the problem was in the calves. But if they still excessively lean forward even with that elevation, we know that the problem is with the hip flexors and abdominals. We're also going to see low back arching, which is more commonly known as lower cross syndrome or an anterior pelvic tilt. That is basically super tight hips and low back muscles, which are pulling up in the back and down in the front. That's causing that anterior tilt. Then we've got weak muscles that are supposed to stabilize the core in the front, and weak muscles in the glutes that pull the pelvis back into a neutral position. So rather than like kicking their glute back neutrally, they're basically arching their back in order to kick the glute. Then we see low back rounding, which is exactly the opposite problem of that. So rather than anteriorly tilting, we're seeing posterior tilting. That's going to be hamstring muscles pulling down in the back instead of a weakened glute, which should be doing hip extension. Now the hamstrings are doing all that hip extension for the gluteal muscles. And then we're going to see underactive core muscles there as well, right? Then one of our last common one in the normal fitness assessments, the normal overhead squat, is going to be the arms falling forward. That is going to be tight lat muscles, which are pulling down, and tight pectoral muscles, which are rounding the chest forward, and underactive upper back muscles, which pull your shoulders back. Now in your pushing and pulling assessment, you are also going to see two distortions here, aside from the low back arching, which in the pushing and pulling assessment means the same thing as it does in the overhead squat. But you are going to see a forward head posture, which is an overactive levator scapulae, which anteriorly tilts your scapula forward, causing your head to have to sit more downward and forward. And then neck muscles that are actually performing that anterior translation. Underactive muscles are going to be your deep cervical flexors, which are supposed to help you look down like this rather than just reaching the head forward. And then the other common one is going to be shoulder elevation, where we see really tight muscles on the upper portion of our neck, right? So our client is basically elevating like this all day in that stressed position, versus muscles that retract and depress your scapula down, like the lower trapezius muscles, rhomboids, and rotator cuff. Lastly, we've got two special ones that we're going to see on the overhead squat. These are from the posterior view. These will not be on the final, but again, these are also things that are going to show up in capstone. You're going to see foot flattening, which is basically pronation of the foot. So when we talked about pronation distortion syndrome, you're going to see the same muscles here. That is going to be your peroneals as a big bad here, which are basically everting your foot. And then that lateral gastrocnemius again, right? Like that outer calf muscle that externally rotates, because that's what pronation is, right? It's a combination of a little bit of dorsiflexion, ankle eversion, and external rotation. So our underactive muscles are going to be the inverters, the internal rotators, like the medial gastrocnemius, and the gluteus medius here actually is going to be underactive as well, because oftentimes when somebody foot flattens, they're also adducting the knees. Usually those two things go together. That's how we get pronation distortion syndrome, right? Foot flattening and knees caving in. So if your hip abductors are weakened, you're getting that over internal rotation there. And then we're going to see heels rising. Occasionally when somebody squats, their heels will actually pop up off the floor, very similar to an excessive forward lean, right? Overactive calf muscles that are preventing dorsiflexion from happening. So basically their body is putting them into that standing on plates position that we kind of mentioned. So that is really everything we've got for our review. Good luck, everybody. We are going to meet again in the park on Monday. I will be sending 2 emails out today. One detail, that contains this link to this video, so obviously you're getting this email. And number 2, details about like where we're going to meet, what time, and what that's going to look like. So that's about everything I got for you guys today. I hope everybody kicks some butt and has a really good weekend. All right, see ya.